Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome to The Drift in Crisis. This is a Starfinder panel that is celebrating everything about the Drift Crisis, which is cause for celebration for us as creators and you as players and GMs, if not for the people whose stories are actually happening in our setting. So this is a hardcover book that has just come out and is fueling all sorts of upcoming adventures. But those sorts of adventures are nothing without great characters. So before we get started on things, let's go ahead and introduce the panelists and folks who are joining us. How about starting with you, Joe?
Hi, yeah, I'm Joe Piscini. I'm Starfinder's lead designer, and I'm also one of the lead developers on the hardcover Drift Crisis book.
And Sol?
Hi, yeah, I'm Sol St. John. I'm an editor at Paizo, and I'm specifically the editing lead on the Drift Crisis hardcover, the Drift Crashers AP tie-in, and I also wrote one of the adventure seeds for the hardcover.
Which we're going to hear a little bit more about in just a bit, too. I'm John Compton. I'm Starfinder Senior Developer. Along with Joe Piscini, I was one of the development leads for this book. And it's really a different book than we've ever done before. Like, when you look back at a lot of the Starfinder books, it's like, behold, a lot of character options, or there are some aliens, or let's explore the setting some. And in fact, a lot of our books are all of those a little bit at the same time. There's no real this is a player book or this is a GM book paradigm for Starfinder. It's a little bit for everybody. But Drift Crisis is yet another category where instead of saying this is a setting, it's more this is an event. And getting there was kind of a process. Joe, do you remember kind of how we started to get into like the Drift Crisis? How we started like why should we do a book like this?
There's so many reasons, right? And I'd love to hear your take on it too. But it's tough. We have a unique challenge, I think, in a galaxy-spanning setting where world-ending threats are kind of a drop in the bucket to some extent. It's like if you and your party are from some world way out in the vast, why do you care that Castrovel in the Pact world is going to blow up thanks to some machinations of some evildoer? You might not. You might not have even heard of Castrovel. So what in a single world based setting might be cause for great adventure and a matter of the utmost import to everyone in the setting, in a galaxy full of worlds, it's a little less so. So we were talking about there are a lot of reasons, like I said, but one of the big things that we felt might be missing in Starfinder is this galaxy-wide impetus for action. That's something that unifies everybody. And we very early on started talking about the drift, right? The drift is something that which is our faster than light speed method of travel in Starfinder, the primary one that most people have access to. And having that go haywire, as we'll discuss in this next hour, just opens up infinite possibilities for all kinds of adventures, including ones that you wouldn't necessarily expect just from travel being disrupted. But it's a big deal, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of something that unites the galaxy, like you said, is really important. And for me, an event like this is also one where it's handy to have a clear start and a clear, or at least a pretty clear end point. The Drift Crisis will eventually get resolved, to be clear. But the fun part about the start of the Drift is that it starts with this thing called the Drift Crash, which is where anybody who was traveling in the Drift at the time has random stuff happen to them. They might have disappeared entirely or gotten spat out somewhere they didn't expect, or even gotten torn apart, or who knows. And like, as we have with the art that's being shown right now, some people get dropped off in places that they are not at all expected to handle. But that's the very basis of like being adventurers, isn't it? And it can be the sort of thing where you can now even start one of these adventures, like just start your campaign with the Drift Crash. And you suddenly have a great survival situation. Or if you want, this can be the sort of thing where you can do the Drift Crash in the middle of your ongoing storyline, if you so desire. The Drift Crisis is really designed in order to be, yes, a thing that unites the entire galaxy, but that you, as your gaming group, can determine how much or how little you want to incorporate it. So if you want to pivot to be a Drift Crash or Drift Crisis campaign, totally awesome. If you just want it to be a background event that people are hearing about while you're doing your existing thing, also totally cool. But it gives that common thread to explore.
Yeah, there's two things that brings to mind that we'll talk about as in this panel a little bit more. But one is that we have advice for existing adventure paths, everything from Dead Suns up to Fly Free or Die. There is content in there that tells you how to incorporate the Drift Crisis into those storylines. So you don't have to drop whatever campaign you might be in and pick up the Drift Crisis. You can smoothly incorporate it. And the other thing is going back to what John was saying about all our books having stuff for GMs, stuff for other players. This is no exception, and a lot of the player content in this book, even though it's themed to Drift Crisis stuff, it's usable all over the place. Like, so for example, one of the adventure seeds, and we'll talk about what those are in a moment, is about chaos on Absalom Station for reasons. But the feats in that section are usable in any sort of chaotic urban environment, which you might find as you travel the galaxy. So you don't have to, as a player, you don't need to be signed up for any of these specific subplots in order to use the options that we're cramming into this book for you.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to, and so I'll jump in whenever with your own thoughts on this too. I'm thinking back to when we were sort of planning out the Drift Crisis and thinking like, okay, we know that we want to do an event to kind of unite the people. Like, what do we want to focus on? Doing it stuff with the Drift was like, the Drift is one of the top 5 concepts that builds the Starfinder setting. So if somebody's just going to have a quick primer of what Starfinder is, the Drift is probably coming up. So it's a very quick like, hey, we're messing with this thing that everybody depends on, and it has big value. But also, the Drift itself is really, really, really easy to use, both in-game, but also as just a player or as a GM. You can go wherever. It's fantastic. But as we started to explore some of our like plot lines, and especially some classic science fantasy and sci-fi tropes, we realized that the Drift kind of cancels out some of those. I remember the author for Tech Revolution, who I had working on some of the transit articles, was like, I just realized that space piracy doesn't work. We like have the free captains and whatnot, but like, where do they actually rob people or waylay people? Because when you're traveling the Drift, like there's no like road to camp out on. You really just have to kind of orbit a planet and hope that somebody pops out near you and go, oh my gosh, it's that, and pull out your space cutlasses or whatever the heck you're doing. And so kind of messing with the Drift a little bit is also kind of a way for us to shake things up a bit to not only enable some current storylines, but to possibly open up some future possibilities for how we can approach some of those storylines or tropes or concepts in the future in a mildly revised setting. Like, this is not going to be a thing where after the Drift Crisis, it's like everything's new and different, but it's like, hey, this is our chance to kind of tweak things here and there. And importantly, this is an opportunity for you as players and GMs to be part of that process and take as much or as little credit for it as you like.
And of course, the exciting part for players and GMs too is getting to explore one of the most exciting parts, I think, of the having it tied into the Drift is that the Drift is while it's fundamental to the setting, it's also one of the most mysterious elements of the setting because it's this thing that came out of basically nowhere, and Triune itself is a god that nobody really understands the intention of Triune or what the Drift is really for, and it's always had this vaguely ominous element to it, and then it suddenly stops working right, and it winds up pulling a lot of things out of the woodwork, bringing a lot, I think, out of the setting that maybe was lying under the surface. Just bringing some mystery, opening the chance to explore some mysteries that weren't necessarily on people's minds before.
I really like that part about bringing to the surface some of the mysteries and whatnot, because one of the fantastic things about working on and outlining Drift Crisis is that we were able to look at basically anything in our setting and say, how would the drift crisis affect this, and include that in what we prompted our authors to write up. And it's been a cool opportunity to go back to some of the places that, might have seemed like a one-time deal and say, okay, hey, you remember this place? We're back there now. It's fantastic. Except, of course, it's all in chaos. And I think that speaks to a lot of the variety of stories that we can tell with the drift crisis. And that shapes what the book is like. There's a whole lot of the book that is dedicated to what we call adventure seeds, which are almost like reading an outline for one of our adventure paths that we would send out to our authors and say, we need to hit this story prompt. We need to have some of these villains. Like this is how the narrative is developing. Instead of these being like room by room adventures, these are more providing you a really detailed framework for how you can create your own variety of campaign. And we did that partly because we realized, looking at this, we couldn't just tell a drift crisis story, or even 2 or 3 drift crisis stories across our standalone adventures or adventure paths. We had to share how to do as many drift crisis stories as possible. And I think that really gets us into like, okay, so now that we've done the drift crash, like, how messed up is the galaxy? What does it mean that we have the drift crisis, guys? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, there's and just a brief primer of the drift for folks who maybe are not sure what's in crisis here. It is the way to travel faster than light in the Starfinder setting. Access to it is via technology only. It's a plane of existence, a transitive plane that lets you pop in to a random spot, kind of travel, and then pop out where you want to be much faster than the centuries or millennia it would take to go there during, in normal space, the material plane. And so that about 300 years ago was made available to basically everyone in the galaxy via a signal from Triune, this deity. And as Sol said, it's very mysterious. Why did this happen? Why did it happen when it happens? We don't really know for sure. But in the book, we cover kind of the status quo of the drift, and then we talk about what has gone wrong, which is quite a few things, unfortunately, for, as John said, like, exciting for us, but not maybe so much for the people living it day to day. So maybe we should talk about some of the things that are going wrong now with the drift.
One thing that I'll add to it is that, actually, 2 very quick points. One is that we tell you some basic mechanics of how the drift operates now that the drift is in crisis. And it's kind of using the drift is really dangerous and unpredictable now, but it's not quite impossible. So it leaves open that door of possibility for exceptionalism, where if you still want to be using a bit of drift travel to facilitate your narratives, that's available. But most people in the setting are like, no, thank you. Absolutely not. Have you read the news articles? The second thing I'll add quickly is that the drift is also the means of intergalactic communication. So in addition to travel being kind of borked, a lot of the communication is messed up. So people aren't necessarily even getting a consistent message in the setting of what's happening where. There's a lot of confusion there.
Oh, and the great thing about covering as many... Oh, sorry.
So,
the great thing about covering as many adventure seeds as we're covering, because keep in mind, we're covering 20 different adventure seeds in this book. And they cover the wide range of the galaxy, from Absalon Station to the Viscarium to Alluvion set in the drift itself to random planets out in the vast where people have just randomly crashed, to just widespread corners that people you haven't thought about for a while. These are set all over the entire universe. You really get a good sense of how much this event affects the entire universe, and it's great. It really does give, even if you just touch on 1 or 2 of the ideas, it does give you a sense of how big this event really was.
Joe, you were going to jump in?
Yes, what was I going to say? Well, I'm inspired now to talk about adventure seeds, because each one of these 20 that Sol mentioned and wrote one of them has, background on what's going on, which, is for GMs more than players, but players are free to usually read at least the introduction to see kind of what's going on. It mentions factions. Each adventure seed talks about factions, which we have a section in the book that details some factions that are becoming more prominent, as well as the ones you'd expect, like Starfinders, for example. What are they up to during this event? But also some interesting factions that we have maybe only name dropped or like barely visited, but are now becoming very important in the light of this event. There's also a rough level range on what kind of adventure this might be appropriate for, what kind of adventurers, and then GM resources, including a new creature for every adventure seed, so or an NPC of some kind. So there's a big section of 20 new creatures to throw at your players. And then, of course, player options with each one. Like I said before, they're thematically tied to the adventure seed, but you're not required to participate in that adventure seed to gain access to those things. So, yeah, adventure seeds are cool, and they are a big part of this book. That was my main point, I guess.
And you mentioned a whole bunch of the background that is primarily for the GM, and I think it's important to note for this book, the first chapter provides a lot of overview and general information as well as player options. But even where we are presenting facts or apparent facts about the drift crisis, we have presented a lot of that stuff in the realm of possibilities. So you're going to find chapter 1 is really player friendly and low spoiler. And it might be like, you can look at it and it's like, yeah, we should talk about what caused the drift crisis as chapter 1. Was it this thing? Was it that thing? Was it that thing? What's happening with Triune? Like, was it A, B, C? And it presents basically all of these things as equally plausible. And in chapter 3 of the book, we do provide a what Paizo is going to be considering a canonical cause and eventual closure to the drift crisis. But if you see something in chapter 1 or anything in chapter 2 that really strikes your imagination that you want to say is in fact the real cause of the drift crisis for your own campaign, you are totally welcome to use that stuff. Like, each one of them is creating their own series of storylines. Like, even the idea of speculating what is happening with Triune, like we have I think it's image number 2 that we can pull up of Triune pulling itself apart. Like, is the drift crisis a thing because Triune was just like, there are 3 parts of me and I can't handle it anymore, we're breaking up, and it's like tearing itself apart? Like, what happened to Triune? And like chapter 1 tells you, even Triune's priests have been trying to contact their deity, and basically they're getting a 404 Triune not found sort of response. So like, and they're getting all sorts of flack because everybody's like, why is my drift broken? Why is my internet down? Triune priests solve this. And they're like, we're not customer support. Like, what do you want from us? Level of thing. I think it also, like, in addition to that being some fun like background information, it can also even be a great thing if you're playing a drift crisis focused campaign to have that be one of your characters, be a Triunite who's really frazzled about this whole thing and is taking it upon themselves to be like part of the solution because they sure as heck don't know what caused the issue. You're here now.
Yeah, there's a great section of the book on some detailed potential causes, and then a table that's just a bunch of like random possibilities. Some of my favorites are that Triune is kind of just co-opted the drift, and its actual creators are back now and they're not happy and they're kicking everyone out. Another is that, when you use the drift, you're kind of pulling in pieces of other planes at random, and other planes have gotten sick of that. And so now some powerful planar entities are banding together to just take back what's theirs and destroy the drift. And then, of course, there's the hoax theory, because there's always going to be people that are like, it's not real.
The drift absorbed bits of planes, and one of them happened to be the equivalent of a drift virus, and now the drift is sick. Whatever it is that you want, like, have fun with it, and whatever rumors you want to seed as kind of that, like, the barks that people overhear as they're like gathering information to try and be like, what caused the thing? Like, give them 13 different rumors and tell them nothing about which one is true or false, and just watch as your players go batty trying to come up with their own theories and add another 13 to it. So in addition to some of the more technical stuff that's happening with the drift, like, there is all of this chaos that's following. So like, hey, transit breaks down, and now people are desperate for various things, whether it's supplies or military backup or whatever. This is a time of opportunists as well. So if ever you wanted to like have skeezy NPCs taking advantage of unfortunate situations, or even if you are playing some of those skeezy mercenary folks who want to be um, pirates of their own making, then this is truly your era. This is an opportunity to also be the isolate kind of turn what is a big galaxy of the Starfinder setting into a tiny little sphere of influence, if you want, where it's like suddenly we can't just leave. Suddenly we can't rely on backup to show up in at most 5d6 days. Um, we are the only solution available. What do?
Yeah,
There's even some
it's
player
surprising how many
options to back that up.
personal. True, so.
Go ahead.
I would say it's surprising how many personal stories you can tell too, because people have disappeared. So one of the factions that we cover in great detail is the Eyes Wide Agency, which is a group of psychics that tracks people down, and their business is booming because there's suddenly a lot of people missing, and you might interact with them, you might maybe become one, you might you might spend all of the drift crisis just trying to track down one person, rather than trying to solve the entire drift crisis for the whole galaxy. It's kind of whatever you want to have happen. It reminds me of one of my favorite adventure seeds too, is called Blazing Speeds, where there's a starship manufacturer claiming to have a safe alternative to drift travel. And without spoiling too much, you have to figure out what in the hell is going on, wink, wink, because it's not all necessarily above board. Yeah.
Yeah, and likewise, talking about taking advantage of the chaos. Honestly, one of my favorites is the adventure scenes taking place with the fact that Absalom Station winds up becoming, because the Starstone is there, it winds up attracting a whole ton of refugees, and they wind up having a major refugee crisis on Absalom Station. And there's a lot of detail given to this one adventure seed about. Or actually, there's a couple of adventure seeds dealing with the potential refugee crisis on Absalom Station, and just the details of not just of both the administrative details of trying to organize, how do you like, it's already hard enough to maintain, a space station full of people where you can't produce your own food the way you can on a planet, but then you suddenly, triple the civilization there, the population there, and suddenly you have all these more people to say, and how do you do that? But then there's, of course, people trying to take advantage of the people there, and people pushing against the refugees the way that you see in the real world. And then they're running out of space, so they start opening up some of the layers where the ghost layers, where you've got or the it's not ghost layers, I don't think it's called, ghost
Ghost
levels. Ghost levels, that's it. The ones where the ones where dark and mysterious things are hiding in the depths of Absalom Station, where people have never gone. And it's all just real interesting, fun, compelling drama, and you never have to leave Absalom Station.
Yeah, and other stuff that's happening on Absalom Station and beyond is kind of tied into that technology angle of how the drift operates, where like this is a science fantasy setting. Like we have a lot of magic going on, and there's been 3 centuries of drift dominance and almost even some kind of technology being the narrative of the galaxy in many ways. And now that a big portion of technology appears to be broken, it's a time for magical resurgence. And some of it's like, we just are going to use magic to solve our problems. And a little bit of it is some of these magicians coming in and being like, neener, 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 we told you so. And so there's an entire adventure seed that is about the followers of Aloratu, god of magic, who have for a long time been looking at drift travel and being like, there's gotta be a catch, or why can't we have something like that? I bet magic could be a solution here. And now that the drift crisis has happened, they're like, now is our chance. And also, we told you so. And maybe even some of them saying, maybe this is our chance just to get rid of all technology entirely. And it's been whatever version of kind of magical faith saying, "Wait a second, now's our moment." You can tell that sort of narrative. We have some good image number 3. I think this Chaos on Absalom Station is a great moment of like, look, we can be having all of those street corner preachers being like, this is the real cause, and whatever it is their particular agenda is that you want to spin into a story, you totally can. Do these people in fact have an interesting magical solution? Magic sometimes has components, material components, costly material components. If they have a solution, at what cost does it come? A lot of our adventure seeds, you're going to find these. What I oftentimes enjoy in adventure narrative is to be able to provide enough fun adventure narrative to support the main theme of the thing, and then to slowly introduce some of the elements that provide some moral ambiguity to it, or some implication or indication of upcoming choices that the PCs are going to make that can take the conclusion in many different ways. And the Circles Within Circles adventure seed, which ties into Allura 2's faith, is very much one of those where it's like, at what cost? And you as the player is having to make that decision of which cost is really worth it, like whose side are we really on, and you get to make that choice again and again in interesting ways. So I'm really excited about that one.
Yeah, that goes back to having factions detailed in the book is super helpful, because even if they're not mentioned in the adventure seed as being involved, they totally can be, especially when you get into the Absalom Station ones. Everybody's there. And the Mord is another faction that we've talked about before, and they're people who are always against drift travel, I think mostly because you're tearing up random pieces of other planes when you use a drift engine, and that's not necessarily that cool to be doing to other planes. So now they are another told you so faction, right? And their numbers are increasing, and their political influence increases because people are like, oh, maybe you were right, that we shouldn't have been relying on this particular technology. And that also leads to, I want to mention our NPC section. We have a couple NPC profiles in the back, a couple, I mean 6, I think, including Alexa Guriani, who is one of the first pilots in the Drift ever. She's an android, so she's long-lived, and she actually disappeared for a long time. But she returned with the Drift crash. What a coincidence. And now she's sort of involved with the Mord. And it's cool because if you go back to like our first article about the Drift, like outside of the core rule book, was in AP number 4, I think, Adventure Path number 4. And there's a quote from her saying like, we're checking out the Drift, it's cool, but what is the price here? Like, why have we been given this gift of intergalactic travel so freely? Like, what will Triune ask of us in return? Kind of foreshadowing maybe what's happening now, maybe not, but certainly her return to the scene adds a lot of interesting questions to explore that, like John and Sol have been saying, it lets you tell a lot of different stories.
And with your mention of like, and as you mentioned with like, the Drift tears bits of other planes, like the Drift is a plane, and like most of our planes that we create for Pathfinder and Starfinder have one or more big categories of outsiders that are associated with them, and the Drift is no exception. We introduced Spectra a while ago, so like, I bet how are the Spectra responding to all of this? I'm pretty sure that Sol, this is something that you wrote pretty extensively about. In fact,
yeah, actually, that was that is the subject of my adventure seed. In no small part because I love outsiders. They're one of my favorite things in a fantasy setting. So I volunteered for the Spectra tied in AP adventure seed. So the one that I wound up writing is called Spectra Corrupted. It does deal with how the Spectra are dealing with the events of the Drift Crisis, and the short version is not well. They yeah, as you can expect, they're a little traumatized by having their entire plane just kind of shut down, and they're all not really. They've kind of been cut off from Triune the same way as everything. They've had the same kind of disconnect as everyone else, and they're. It's interesting because because of course the Spectra is mysterious as anything else about the Drift. Like we've always been kind of given this implication that the Spectra have a mission, like they're serving some kind of. Uh, the Spectra are always presented like they're bringing messages and keeping contact with the people in the other planes and serving some kind of purpose for the Drift. And so when the Drift suddenly stops working, the Spectra suddenly lose their purpose and they don't know what to do with themselves anymore. And what they wind up doing, at least in the Adventure Seed, is rallying behind one particular Whisperia Spectra, one of the higher level tree of knowledge type spectras, the ones who were known to collect information about other planes and generally act as like personal librarians. What she starts rallying people to, she winds up just she winds up rallying other spectra to joining her and thinks that the short version here is that she thinks that she's part of Triune, and specifically she starts calling herself, she thinks that she's Cassandra Lee, short version.
One of Triune's aspects.
One of Triune's aspects, yeah. She thinks that she is Cassandra Lee, and so people start calling her false Cassandra. And she's fine with that because her ultimate goal is to reunite Triune. And so because that gives the Spectra something to work for, they start working towards this goal together because they were created for a purpose, they need a purpose now. And so as long as that gives them something to work towards. But of course not all of them fall to her, not all of them work towards their side. They're all independent creatures. They're just like anyone else. They have their own factions.
Yeah,
but it is interesting.
One thing that I'll add to that. First off, we have image 5 of False Cassandra that we can share as well. Just showing how some Spectra get a little frazzled by what has happened and decide that now's the time for a little bit of a visual change up to represent how I feel about life and existence. So, I mean, you think your pandemic hair is bad. False Cassandra has her own opinions. But one of the other things is that the Spectra are kind of this flexible element in whatever Drift Crisis story you're telling, and kind of illustrate how you can take some of these adventure seeds and, if you want, mash several of them up together and just pull the pieces that you want into a complex narrative. But that just as we as players, player characters don't necessarily know what did or did not cause the drift crash, and just as various characters in the story might be blaming different people, the Spectra are doing the same thing. When they try to access Triune and say, hey God, what's up? And get no answer, they're like, okay, we solve our own problems. And some of them are, blaming the priests of Triune. Some of them are blaming just everybody using the drift. Like, was the drift travel evangelism a lie? Some of them are blaming each other. Like, if you want to incorporate rogue Spectra or upset Spectra or even desperate Spectra who think they might be able to help solve things if just they had a little bit of extra help, like any of those things are great ways to use Spectra, from all the way from stolid ally to most vengeful enemy. This neutral aligned creature type can serve any role in this crisis, because they're all over the place now.
Including, we have one of the exciting archetypes that we have for players is tied into the Spectra, the Spectra Scion. So
what
that's
is that about?
Exciting. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's pretty much what it sounds like. Well, not exactly. It's not exactly what it sounds like because it's not like the Spectra equivalent of a geniekin or something, but it is somebody who is closely tied to the Spectra and has gotten, for whatever reason, their trust and their benefits and gifts from the Spectra because they've managed to ally with one of them, and it's just a neat little extra connection if you want to build a character who has, for whatever reason, befriended a Spectra. Maybe you got lost in the drift and somebody in a Spectra helped you. Maybe you found a Spectra who got wounded after the drift crisis and put them back together. Lots of
Ooh.
possibilities.
Yeah, and like Joe mentioned earlier in this panel, like this is one of those great character options where it sure is fantastic for the Drift Crisis, but that if you wanted to use it for any other campaign, it's timeless. So have fun with it.
Yeah, that's a great point. There are four themes actually. And I would say Drift Crashed as a theme is pretty tied to the Drift Crisis, but there's Refugee, there's Opportunist, and then, as Sol said, there's the Spectra Scion, and those are all really interesting regardless. But going the other way, if you want to say like, oh, we're going to start an adventure that is heavily Drift Crisis influenced, well, then you have the tools to, from the ground up, build a character that is fully Drift Crisis compatible, or like infused with sort of. That's how. What's exciting to me is like having a character that comes out of this. You were just nobody before. You were a traveling merchant or whatever, and then the drift crash happened and ejected you into some random plane, or the drift crisis disrupted your day-to-day life in any number of ways, and that is what led you to adventuring, and that could be the seed of your character that will go on to outlive the drift crisis, right? That eventually it will end, as you and your table decides is appropriate, and you'll still have that sort of history of where you came from, and I think that's really cool. And the fact that it's an event, we've been talking a lot about this hardcover book, and the next panel will be talking about specific other products, other adventures that you can have. And we've of course talked a lot about all the adventure seeds here, but this really is an event. Like, this is something that's happening in Starfinder across every conceivable, avenue of in playing Starfinder. So it begins with this hardcover, but it does not by any means end there.
Yeah, and I like how you'd mentioned kind of player tools at the beginning there, because that brings up that like it's not just tools for the players. Once we get to chapter 3, we have all sorts of really exciting tools that are more pointed toward a GM. We'd mentioned earlier in the panel that like that is where we kind of provide a little sidebar of, hey, if you want to know about the canonical end and cause, here's where it is. But who can talk a little bit about some of the other tools that are showing up there?
Sorry, I'll let Sol talk if you want, but I'm also excited.
No, go ahead.
Okay, cool.
Go ahead.
All right, my bad. We got the 20 new creatures, right? Some of which are more NPCs than like alien kind of creatures, but there's all sorts of weird and interesting stuff that again is thematically tied to specific adventure seeds, but can be used kind of anywhere. Then we have a secret treasures table, which is just a bunch of treasure that's sort of sorted by value, so it can be applied to any group, really, given out to any group. And it's just thematic stuff that is sort of thematic to the Drift Crisis. But
I love these
really
treasures so
changes
much.
the treasure. Yeah, I do too. It goes, instead of finding, oh, you found another cred stick worth 10,000 credits. You found, I don't know, let me look. There's a 1/1000 scale replica of an Iomedean cathedral ship with, masterful craftsmanship or whatever.
I like how a lot of these set up
robotic crew.
I like how a lot of these treasures really set up their own micro adventure hooks, and that's really one of the running marching orders that we were conveying a lot during the course of this book's production, is like build in hooks, provide ways that people can look at this book and say, ooh, I want to play that, or I want to tell that story. And a lot of these treasures are ones that they find them and they're like, oh, wait, I know that we were trying to solve the drift crisis or whatever else we were doing, but like this 5,000 credit 17 through 18 result, a 200-year-old bottle of Queen's Best Choice, a prestigious Shiraz wine from a now defunct winery, has a holographic message projector projecting the note of "Bring this when you change your mind about our joint venture," and it has a set of coordinates in the vast. And like, you know how players work. They're going to be like, we're supposed to save the universe, but wait, we could try and meet with whoever this person is who's probably been dead for a century and like put on a fake mustache and pretend to be whoever it is her contact was. Like that's just how players operate. Like and you know, Starfinder is already a game of choices and opportunities, and like this treasure table and its possibilities are no different.
Yeah, that's immediately followed by artifacts, 4 artifacts, which I'll not completely spoil, but there was one that is called The Glimpses of the Endless Horizon, which is a holy text of Waydan, and it helps you navigate with starships and stuff. But it also, if you want, could tie into one of the NPC profiles, which is another tool in the back here, or I call it the back in Chapter 3, which is a profile of an NPC who, along with her crew, claims to be mortal avatars of Waydan. And they've been mentioned before, but now you get to learn more about them, about this captain and also her crew, and you know, make your own calls as to what involvement they may or may not have with the drift crisis in general, or this artifact, or however you want to sort of intertwine things. It's really up to you. And then the other major tool I'd mention is the adventure path advice. If you are already in an adventure path, we tell you, hey, here's how you can kind of incorporate the drift crisis into that adventure path without, you know, throwing the book out and starting a whole new campaign, because obviously you've made an investment in that adventure, and we don't expect people to just, you know, stop caring about all the cool things that are happening in their current adventure. So this is like advice on events and NPCs that might act differently or play out a slightly different way because of the drift crisis happening, whether it's, you know, more in the background or more right in the foreground. So
and if you're interested in more about that, stick around for the adventuring and drift crisis panel right after this, which I will be popping over for.
Yeah. And just one more thing to add on to what Joe had said about the adventure paths and crisis. Specifically, those are not just how to convert adventure paths in general. They are about, hey, for this adventure path, here's what you could change. All the way from Dead Suns through Fly Free or Die. And while it doesn't necessarily cover any of the ones that follow that, if you read over a couple of those, you're going to see some patterns in how they start to, in the questions they start to ask of the adventure path and how they start to answer it. And that should inspire you as a GM who might be running any of our later adventure paths, like Horizons of the Vast, to say, here's how I want to change things up, or here's how I want to incorporate the drift crash. So one of the phenomena that we oftentimes see is like, hey, whole brand new cool adventure has come out, and people are like, I really want to play that, but my group still has 3 volumes left of this AP, so we'll get to you in a year. And we're like, no, play it now. So this is a really different approach to how we present some of our adventure content, is showing you how you can adapt or even pivot to tell an ever-evolving story. Speaking of pivoting, though, like we're getting close to the end here. And as the drift crisis approaches its eventual end, there's going to be kind of this question of, what does it mean going forward? Like, what are some of the things in broad strokes that the drift crisis might open up for us, or even for some of these GMs and players?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in a very broad sense, what does an event like this mean for Starfinder as a brand, as a game overall? Like, what possibilities are there now that we're doing something like this? This is new for us, right? This is new for everybody. So we're really excited to see. I mean, it's already been really fun to see people speculating on what might be causing the drift crisis, and talking about adventures they want to have. So just seeing how this plays out is something that we're keeping a very close eye on, because it could very well inform sort of the things that we do in the future, right? But in terms of in setting stuff, you know, we've already worked on stuff that is that is directly tied to certain changes that will come about as the result of the drift crisis. I don't know if I want to, I'll leave it to you two to decide if we specify any more than that. It is in the book, so you can read up, if you want to read about some of the potential outcomes of the drift crisis, that is in there. And we are taking some of those things and running with them in a big way. So it's very exciting to have that sort of track laid out in front of us, where we can go all sorts of different ways, and in fact already are. So maybe that's too vague. I leave it to you two.
So, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I was thinking that there's also the fact that this is a year-long event, so we've got things that are playing out not just in this book and in the two APs that are connected to it, but also we've got scenarios that are playing out over an organized play that'll be tied into it, and a couple of other things that down the line that might be tied in, might not be. We'll see. There's a few other things down the line this year that could be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, one of the other wonderful things about the drift crisis, and kind of it being a fun experiment on Starfinder's part, is that we are opening the doors to so many different stories being told, but also potentially being true. Like, we're really excited as creators to be hearing about what you are doing with the drift crisis. Are you playing the APs as written? Fantastic. Are you playing any of the other published adventures that we're doing? Cool. Are you creating your own based on some of these adventure seeds? Have you taken one of these adventure seeds and given it its own novel twist? And like, what version of the cause of the drift crisis or the solution to the drift crisis did you go with? Did you mash up some of these adventure hooks? These are all stories that like can kind of simultaneously, in a witch warper way, be true, because it's a big galaxy. And even if you are playing out a drift crisis story that is only affecting one small moon somewhere in the vast, you are part of a greater whole. You are telling a part of a much bigger story, and together it just makes the drift crisis so much more interesting. So we're excited to hear about it. But on top of that, this has coincided really nicely with the fairly recent release of Pathfinder Infinite and Starfinder Infinite. So this is also an opportunity for you to be exploring some of these adventures and narratives in a published way, if you want to be creating some of the content using that licensing program and sales platform. So like, if you want to be elaborating upon the various cool ideas that are in this book and providing more pick up and go sorts of adventure content for others to enjoy, this is a great moment to get in on that. So Drift Crisis is just a huge storytelling possibility, and we're so thrilled to see what happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can't wait.
Got just about 2 or 3 more minutes before we need to wrap up. So any closing thoughts that people want to add into that?
I mean, I'd love to spout off some of the cool things that are in the book for players that are sort of, and some of the adventure seeds you might not necessarily expect. So, for example, there's a swarm-focused adventure where the player option are sort of anti-swarm, anti-telepathy weapons that break up the hive mind ability of many swarm creatures. And it's because, the swarm is also disrupted by the drift crash and drift crisis and can't reinforce some planet that they're trying to take over. And so there's a resurgence in effort to take back, to fight off the swarm. And so that, like, who would see that coming necessarily, but it is a consequence of the drift crisis. There's one of my favorites is the sort of what we've been calling in-house the Drift Titanic storyline, which is there's this huge luxury ship that wants to go on a maiden voyage. And, because of hubris, they're like, we'll be fine. We can go into the drift. It's not fine. It doesn't work out well for them. But if you're there on the ship, you get to have quite the adventure. And that also, the player options.
And the best thing about that one,
the
best thing about that one is you're constantly you have to deal with Zoe the entire time you're on that ship. He's just constantly there bothering you the whole time you're dealing with that Drift Titanic situation. It's great.
Nothing capitalizes on a crisis like a reality TV host.
Exactly.
And my other favorite bit, and I forget if we already showed the Vorklash art,
I don't think we have. That's image 4, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is a creature that's formed when planar material gets mashed up together by the drift, and that's another big theme of the drift crisis and the drift crash is that planar material is being ejected all over the place and back into other planes where it doesn't belong. And so the number of stories that adventure seed is more of a like, here's a billion different things that could have happened, and they're all really interesting. Each one could be its own fun adventure, and sort of the player option that goes along with that is a bunch of planar themed magic serums, which I just love. So there's just so much in here that is really can be really unexpected, and I really think it speaks to the galaxy spanning event that we've got going on here. So I really hope people enjoy it and tell us all about their adventures in it.
Yes, please tell us everything. I want to hear. I want to hear everything on social media. I want to hear adventures.
Same.
Fantastic. So, all sorts of opportunities ahead. Drift Crisis is a hardcover book that is, I think came out officially about 2 days ago. So you can pick it up right now, whether it's in your local game store, on Paizo.com, etc. We got digital PDF versions as well. So dig into it. Have fun, tell great stories. And if you want more great stories, stick around because in about 10 minutes, there's going to be a follow-up panel about telling stories in the Drift Crisis. Not only some of our upcoming published adventures, but other possibilities where Sol's going to be joining in with some other quality panelists. And we really hope to see you then. It's been fantastic. And have a great PaizoCon, whether it's in person or online.